Well, and thank you for organising this wonderful event. I mean, I've been here 7 years and we've never had anything like this. And my background cuts across philosophy and science, actually. My A-levels a long time ago were in sciences, and I'm the only person I've ever met that has a BSc, a Bachelor of Science, in philosophy. The 4-year program at the University of Wales. And I've got very broad interests, but I've continued to be very interested in science. And I'm now the director of the Centre for Bioethics and Emerging Technologies, which is about philosophy and ethics in relation to science and technology. And as most of you know, I've been working on nanotechnology and its ethical issues for quite some time. It's really great to be able to move into an area which has held my interest for a long time, but not been an opportunity to do so really at St. Mary's until now. So thank you, Elisabetta. Tante grazie. Right. What I'm going to do today is very simple really, and that is not really got a positive thesis so much as to ask, well, what is the major obstacle to this kind of reintegration that the Vice-Chancellor was just talking about? And I'm one of those that does think reintegration is not only possible, but actually very pressing and very important, which is one reason why I thought it was important to talk about Pope Francis's forthcoming encyclical on climate change, because that, again, cuts across theological issues and science and technology. So very much looking forward to what the Pope has to say about that. I think that will be quite groundbreaking. So my thesis is, well, what is the major obstacle to this reintegration? And I use the term scientism. Not science, but scientism as a major obstacle. And that's what I want to talk about by showing that scientism is indeed an ideology and is a blockage, and that it is riddled with invalid arguments and with falsity. So where's that button? Right here it is. Button not working. We're getting this sluggish. Oh, it's just done it. Right, it'll probably go to a second one now because I pushed it twice. So. Right, I just want to emphasize this wonderful Greek term which I came across when I was doing a master's degree in ancient Greek philosophy at Edinburgh University, the notion of aporia. Aporia means some sort of mental blockage, an impasse, especially in reasoning or inquiry, deep puzzlement or doubt. This is not caused by not having enough instruments or techniques or factual data, but there's something deeply wrong with the way we are conceiving the situation. And we can feel that there must be something wrong in my conception or in my approach. And there's no way forward. Now, many of us will just back off from that. But my thesis is that aporia is actually the way into more light. That when the mind becomes blocked, that is a fact that is of great importance. Because we have to ask, why is it blocked? What is the nature of this? What is the nature of this blockage? An examination, I think, of the foundations of scientific inquiry does result in a stopping point, a point beyond which the mind cannot go. And I think we've had lots of intimations of that today. Now, again, I must emphasize that I'm not saying that this is because we need more science. I'm saying that there are limits to science, and we have to acknowledge the limits to science. And I think we are beginning to. So, a failure to understand this aporia results in scientism, which is an ideology, and a dominant ideology of our present era, together with other ideologies such as consumerism. It's a scientific conceit, and results in the misdirection of science and technology, which I've spoken about many times in other places, and people have heard me speak about the follies of the Large Hadron Collider, and the project of putting a man on Mars, I think, is the most recent absurdity which emanates from scientism. Why is this important? Because scientism wrongly closes the door on religion. So I'm not a theologian, I'm not going to say much about religion, but I'm going to say something about what it is about our society that is blocking that doorway. Because that needs to be That needs to be confronted. We have to understand the limitations of science, because once we've done that, we've then debunked, not debunked science. Of course, it's tremendously useful, but that's all it is. It's just useful. You know, that's the end of the matter, really. That it's useful. Once we understand the limitations, then we're left with enormous issues about human life, and that's where we should be going. Right? So, aporia, can't do without it. Let's confront it. So I'm going to take issue with scientism. Now, the foundations of science, I say, actually have no foundations. Now, some of you have spoken about perhaps religion providing a foundation, but I'm talking about the foundations of science. If you look at science itself, whether science has scientific foundations, I would say at its apparent foundation, there's just unanswerable questions, and not because of a shortage of technique. There's unanswerable questions, there are paradoxes, there's a lot of muddle. In short, there are a lot of unanswerable questions. Right? Not just questions which we haven't answered, but unanswerable questions. And that's the point that we have to understand here. Now, to show this, I'll just present two laws of the laws of nature. Now, most of us we'll take it for granted that there are something called laws of nature, and that's fine, that's workable, because science is all about workability. And without some constants, without some rules, laws, we couldn't begin to model this thing we call reality. However, do those laws of nature themselves have any foundation? Now, if we look very closely at the things which we call, for example, physical constants, we see that we are up against aporia, because there's no apparent reason why constants have the value that they do, or whether in fact in some wider theory those constants might turn out not to be constants at all. We could just change the value to suit our purpose. So we're up against this idea of okay, laws of nature, but what is this logical status of the laws of nature? They're functional, they work, okay, but are they the ultimate description of reality which science would like to believe that they are? Because if they are, we don't need religion. Right. Now, you probably never heard this before, and I hadn't heard of this myself until I invented it yesterday over a glass of wine. I mean, it does have a way of getting the mind working, as long as it's only half a glass of wine. Two fundamental and irresolvable aporia of scientific inquiry that indicate the limits of scientific inquiry. First of all, what I call the law of the inexplicability of consciousness, and two, the law of the incompletability of science. It's just my way of packaging sort of two clear manifestations of aporia in scientific inquiry. What do I mean by these things? Well, first of all, the law of the I can't even say that word, inexplicability of consciousness. Now, in philosophy, some of you will know that there's been kind of a project going on for about 20, 30 years now, trying to explain consciousness. You know, I've spent quite a lot of time showing that this is actually quite illogical. Consciousness is a precondition for explaining anything. If you haven't got consciousness, then there's no explanation. Explanation exists in our consciousness. So there's a circularity here, right? Consciousness is a precondition for scientific inquiry. Because think of any theory you like, genetic theory, any theory, where is the theory except in our minds? And the theories change, one supersedes another, some are functional in some circumstances, non-functional in another situation. There's something that I want to try to give an exegesis of what has been said by Chalmers here. But there's a whole group of philosophers who refer to something called the hard problem. What they mean by the hard problem, it precisely is the difficulty, well, and I would say impossibility, of explaining consciousness. What you can do is give some of the necessary conditions for being conscious. So, for example, if I didn't have a head, then I wouldn't be conscious. If I didn't have neurons, then I wouldn't be conscious, etc. But what they can't explain is my subjective experience as a manifestation of all those material conditions. So, This is the typical way a philosopher expresses himself in such a way that is very precise but totally incomprehensible until one has read it at least 16 times. Thomas Nagel says something very similar in a well-known paper, What is it like to be a bat? Bats probably live in quite a different, with a different sense of reality, since they operate by echolocation rather than the five senses that we have. So what kind of, could we even imagine how they would construct their world? He's saying the same kind of thing, but you'd have to read it about 3 times before you understood what he's saying, but it does have the advantage of being very precise. So in short, this is how I'll put this across in a nutshell. Although one can find that, e.g., certain molecules, chemistry, neural connections, etc., are necessary conditions for love, joy, hope, grief, etc., it does not follow that these are, there are nothing but these conditions. That is, that love, for example, or grief, is reducible to molecules. I mean, it is true that if there weren't certain hormonal systems, also you wouldn't be in a position to feel love or grief. But you can't turn that around and say, well, actually, it doesn't matter how hard you look at molecules, you're not going to find love or grief in them. There's some sort of gap here, and this is what Chalmers calls the hard problem. So examining a molecule cannot possibly, the emphasis on the word possibly, it's a question of logical possibility, you cannot possibly find love or grief. Just 2 different universes of discourse going on here. But that is not to deny that one can provide lots of material necessary conditions that underlie, but that doesn't follow that you can reduce one to the other. So, logical precondition. The notion of conceptual precondition that cannot be described because it functions as the prior condition of any description is largely alien to the scientific project. In other words, scientists hardly ever step out of their shoes and ask, how as a subject am I framing, how is my being the subject framing this issue, playing a part in the issue itself? There must be underlying assumptions, which could be otherwise, and so on. So it's almost as though, because science has to operate with presumptions about objectivity. So the subject is absent. It's only recently with quantum mechanics that we're beginning to see that there's an observer issue here, and which has got us into a real tangle if you read the philosophy of quantum mechanics books. So this is an issue of philosophy, of logic, is preoccupied with the logical limits of scientific knowledge since Kant. So ultimately then, there is no vantage point outside consciousness that can throw light on the nature of consciousness as consciousness. That is, that there is consciousness at all, or that is what Chalmers calls the hard problem, and what I call aporia. That we cannot overlook this issue. Because if you face the issue, you're left with a deep sense of almost shock that here is something that is inexplicable. It's the precondition of my having any theory about anything at all. Now, that could lead us into completely, and should lead us in a completely different direction. Something that has nothing to do with science, in other words. Okay? So what I call sometimes meta-consciousness is in fact recognized, has been recognized in the history of philosophy, but usually in a contorted way, e.g. by Kant and by Wittgenstein. But I won't bore you with quotations from those 2 philosophers. So it is that stands outside the ambit of scientific explanation. So that's the first indication, and I could give many indications, that science has limits of a logical, conceptual kind, which undermine any claim it could make to having a complete and consistent account of reality. A complete and consistent account of reality is impossible. As a scientific enterprise. The law of the incompletability of science, so this gets even more intriguing. but could also get rather technical, because I'm not going to do that today. And anyway, I'm not a physicist. Now I have the privilege of talking to Elisabetta and increasing numbers of scientists in St. Mary's, so I can learn a lot. Many leading scientists are now maintaining, and it's also in the popular scientific view, that in principle, all the basic laws and constants of nature can and will be unified, consistent, coherent, and complete. Now, this is a popular view, but it's also the view of some eminent scientists, but not of all of them, because doubts are arising everywhere now. This is the idea of the completability of science. Does anyone hold this view? Oh, you bet. A lot of eminent scientists do. And that this is one of the bedrocks of this blockage which I'm calling scientism, especially in the popular view, and which closes the door on a religious viewpoint. That is a theory that explains all physical phenomena, and possibly, people are ambivalent about this, all social and mental ones, is possible according to this ideology. Now, examples, well, I could spend all day giving examples, and of course there are scientists that do have a more subtle, nuanced approach to this whole idea. But our dear physicist Stephen Hawking has already been mentioned in A Brief History of Time. 10 million copies sold, so you can imagine the impact this has on our culture. That the completion of physics is near, and he declares, I still believe there are grounds for cautious optimism that we may now be near the end of the search for the ultimate laws of nature, and a complete, consistent, unified theory is only the first step. Our goal is a complete understanding of the events around us and of our own existence. Oh, my heart sinks, and my heart sinks. This is an intelligent man. He's a clever man. He's not a wise man. He doesn't see that there's a deep logical flaw in his thinking. Well, Francis Crick, Nobel Prize winner, another very clever man, not a very wise one, DNA fame. He persevered until his death in 2004 in trying to find a reductionist explanation even for consciousness. In his book, The Astonishing Hypothesis, and it is an astonishing hypothesis, but for the wrong reasons, he writes, subjective you, the person that's looking out on the world right now, your joys and sorrows, your memories, your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. I am really astonished. You see, at least the title of the book is very accurate. Well, growing doubts, of course, not all scientists affirm this kind of scientism. This makes what we're doing here in St. Mary's quite exciting, actually, that now the door is just beginning to open again. And Paul Davies was mentioned earlier. Now, this is a chap that's not only clever, but I think has got some wisdom. A British physicist, awarded Royal Society's Faraday Prize, got the Templeton Prize in 1995, said in his popular physics book, The Mind of God, that he seriously doubts whether we could obtain final knowledge through science because of internal theoretical and mathematical limits. Understanding the nature of those and why they are limits is a key to reopening that door. Right, incompletability symptoms. Well, just a couple of things here. Gödel's theorem. Mathematicians assumed for a long time that there must be a procedure to demonstrate the truth of all mathematical propositions in an axiomatic system. If there were no such guaranteed procedure, then how could we be sure that there weren't contradictions in that system? Then comes along Gödel and upsets the apple cart. He did something very clever. He showed that this assumption was false. There was no such procedure of complete decidability. It meant that the consistency or freedom from contradiction of arithmetic cannot be proved by arithmetic itself. This was an enormous shock to scientists as well as mathematicians, because physics and other sciences depend on mathematics. Now, this discussion can become very technical and is still controversial, and there are people who would disagree with my acceptance of the significance of this. But there is a wider issue about the nature of mathematics. There was a time when we were all Euclideans, because Euclid, had a very neat geometry in which, for example, the angles of an isosceles triangle added up to 180 degrees. Somehow this was a description of how the world was. There come along some other geometers, for example, Lobachevsky, Riemann, who said, well, what if we assume that they don't add up to 180? What if we tweak that a bit? So we have a triangle with curved sides, because the angles don't add up to 180. People laughed and said, well, what would be the use of that? That's silly, that's pointless. And then, of course, relativity theory comes along, and decided it was actually a very useful model. So you see, it's not that mathematics gives us a key to the way that things are, is that we bend the mathematics to fit the models of reality that we currently have. And a bit of this play is going on with this issue about the Higgs boson, because I don't think we've found a Higgs boson. I think what will happen is that we'll now, instead of spending $10 billion, we'll now spend $20 billion to find some other little particles that are even smaller, and then that will go on. It's sort of infinite regress because it's actually incompletable. But that's another issue which we can discuss another day. Another one that's recently come into controversy, and this is really anathema to the people who follow scientism, in that the so-called constants of nature may not be constant. So they're not constants of nature, but they actually have a use within a certain theory or certain model. Right. There's a whole issue of the Scientific American, which I bought, I think about 3 years ago now, which I was very excited to read, because the front cover is about this issue of about the constants of nature. Now, if constants are not constants, but they might be constant within a frame of reference, but not ultimately constant, then science would be revealed to be partial, piecemeal, or provisional. Because you see, so science trumpets the idea that it's got the laws of nature, it's uncovered them. And therefore, it's heading towards a complete picture. Now, if it turns out that constants are only relative to the theory that you're working with, and if you work with a different theory, then the constants might be inconstant, it shatters the idea that it is science that is going to provide us with a foundational picture. Such constants, by the way, include the speed of light in a vacuum, the gravitational constant, Planck's constant, fine structure constant, which indicates the strength of an electromagnetic field. The fine structure constant is an interesting one, so I'll go on to say something about that in a moment. But have constants always been the same? Well, some scientists are beginning to think not. And then, why do constants have the peculiar numbers, the peculiar quantity that they do have? Well, nobody can tell you. They're just odd, very odd numbers. Some of them, decimal points that regress into infinity. This is where, again, one gets a sense of aporia. I think, can't make sense of that. And it's not because I haven't got fine enough instruments. There's something odd about the way I'm thinking about this. These constants are not derived from the theory. They're not derived from the theory. They are just peculiar numbers obtained from observation or experiment and parachuted into theories to make them work. The tiniest variation in any of these constants and matter itself would disappear. So with the fine structure constant, carbon would disappear, and life as we know it depends on carbon. So just the tiniest little tweak of the 10th decimal point, and carbon would suddenly disappear, and we'd all disappear. There's something very odd about the way we're conceiving this. But what is the explanation for that oddness? Okay, Richard Feynman. I like this quote because now Richard Feynman is somebody that I do tremendously admire, with a geniuses of science, a really, really clever thinker that could, with a sort of curved ball, suddenly change the whole playing field. And he looked at the fine structure constant, by the way, which is approximately 1 over 137.035, etc., 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 roughly. He said, in exasperation, it's one of the greatest damn mysteries of physics, a magic number that comes to us with no understanding by man. You might say the hand of God wrote that number, and we don't know how he pushed the pencil. Everything depends on this little number, which we can't even complete. And we don't know why it's there, and we just parachuted it in because it makes everything else work. Okay, conclusion. Well, 2 what I call meta-laws, laws about the status of the laws of nature. And I've outlined, in outlining them, I've tried to undermine the claim that science can provide an ultimate explanation, that it's completable. Deep and honest examination of the very foundations of scientific inquiry take us to aporia, a limit beyond which we cannot possibly go. The significance of this is that the door to religion is wide open. Just finished with these 2 little books. This one I bought a long time ago, about 20 years ago, on the left. Look at the title, On the History of the Warfare of Science with Theology in Christendom. From Creation to the Victory of Scientific and Literary Methods. This was written in 1896. It greatly exaggerates this so-called warfare, although to give him some credit, at the end he does say that he doesn't think religion's going to go away, that the belief in God is going to become more and more important. This very recent book, which is a real cracker, The Genesis of Science, How the Christian Middle Ages Launched the Scientific Revolution. So now this is back to the integration idea, because what Hannam is saying basically is that without Islam and Christianity and their pursuit of understanding in a very holistic way, including a God in the picture, we wouldn't have modern science. It's all part of one pursuit. And he shows this very carefully. So, I mean, I would strongly recommend that you look at that book. And that's all I have to say today. Thank you. There's some references. I'll stop there.